Hello everyone! In this video I'll be taking an analytical look at one of the SNES's finest. I'm AesirAesthetics and this is EarthBound. Before going forwards, I want to advise playing the game if you haven't already, since its lessons will be hard to fully understand from just this video, and because a solid frame of reference will make digesting the content contained within it easier. This video is the 7th in my retro analysis series, and if you're interested, I've left links to the other videos in the description box below. I also want to warn you that I have a lot of fondness for the game, so having laid my biases on the table, I'd say it's time you grab yourself a cup of coffee and prepare to take notes as we delve into the subject. EarthBound released in 1994 on the SNES, and a year later it was released in the West. It follows the adventures of a young boy named Ness, who was named for the NES, and his friends as they save the world from a cosmic destroying alien known as Gygus. EarthBound's Western release is a rollercoaster ride that got started with its name, for you see, EarthBound is Mother 2. Mother 1 was not released in the West until just a few years ago, but Nintendo wanted the Mother series to be a staple, so after giving Mother 2 some stellar localization and a new name, they created a, for the time, huge marketing campaign which consisted of scratch and sniff stickers and a tagline that read, "This game stinks." As strange as it may sound, the game didn't meet its goals and the series' tumultuous relationship with its Western fans began. But in Japan, sales were good, and it was likely driven by the fact that the game's director, Shigesato Itoi, has some star power over there. Itoi also oversaw the development of the first Mother game, and the series is based on some of his childhood experiences. Itoi got his job with Nintendo after having pitched the first game to them, only to be directed to talk to Miyamoto. Miyamoto's sway with the company was big enough that he could greenlight the project to see how it played and from there decide if it was a good idea to pursue. Itoi's celebrity actually worried Miyamoto, since games relying on star power generally weren't very good, but the game got developed, launched, and received its fair share of accolades. Then, when it came to developing Mother 2, Nintendo was introducing a new console, so development got shifted to the SNES, but as so often with new hardware, technical difficulties arose, and for the length of the game's 5 years in development, there was always a reality of the game being cancelled. After its original release, EarthBound has been most famously known as that weird RPG which Satoru Iwata worked on, and his involvement cannot be understated. When he joined the project, deadlines got met and milestones reached. EarthBound had a real powerhouse creative team, and the camaraderie behind the scenes is very apparent in the actual game. Itoi has stated that at EarthBound's core there's the relief of having others around you and not being doomed to be alone. For the remainder of this video I'll be using that theme as my analytical lens, and I'll be viewing the game through its attempts to convey it. Now, with that said, let's look at the game's opening. The first piece of gameplay is the character naming screen, which just quickly introduces the player to the other members of Ness's party and then gives the player the ability to rename Ness, them, and Ness's favorite things, which creates a bond of interest between Ness and the player. After seeing that the opening takes place in Onacht in Eagleland, the story begins when Ness is awoken by a crashed meteorite and goes out to investigate it. There's a short section in Ness's house which introduces Ness's sister Tracy and his mom. Then, after Ness leaves the house, he eventually hits a dead end when he's not permitted to pass police roadblocks. Also stuck in that dead end is Pokey Minch, who is Ness's neighbor and sorta friend. His introduction sets him up as an obnoxious rival to Ness. Ness then walks back home, which is when the opening essentially goes on repeat. Ness wakes up and sets out to investigate the noise, but this time, there'll be some combat. When Ness answers the door, he's greeted by Pokey. His brother Picky has gone missing, so Pokey asks Ness to help him search. This is when the game's central theme sees some setup. First off, Ness's mom suggests that their dog joins Ness's party and that Ness arms himself. If Ness talks to Tracy, she'll give him a cookie, and before the player can exit, Ness's dad calls and introduces the player to the currency system. This setup is very important, and I'll get into why a bit later on. The game eases the player into combat by having Ness and the gang fight very easy opponents. Then, when they reach the meteorite, the dog leaves, they find Picky, and a time-traveling bee named BuzzBuzz. BuzzBuzz gives some expository dialogue which colors Gygas as a villain and Ness as a hero. He also gives some complimentary dialogue and then joins the party. On their way to deliver the Mince Boys back to their home, the team is accosted by Starman Jr., who's one of Gygas' servants. The ensuing battle is more or less just a brief glimpse of the late game combat and serves as a stark contrast from the fights Ness has had up until now. There are psi powers being flung around like crazy, and the only party member who accomplishes anything of worth is BuzzBuzz. Another effective use of contrast in the opening is after the battle when Ness delivers the Mince Boys back to their home. The Minch parents are cruel, whereas Ness's parents were caring. Effective use of contrast is a good way to highlight two opposing elements, and the real kicker for the Minch's characterization is when Pokey's mom kills BuzzBuzz. With his dying words, BuzzBuzz gives the players some info they'll need for their journey, gives Ness a crucial item, and gives him some words of encouragement. The player then leaves the Minch house only to be met with a sunrise and a more upbeat theme which creates that desire for adventure. This is when the player can first meet the game's photographer who, fun fact, was added in by Iwata. The game's opening serves as a good tutorial and as an inciting incident does a good job setting up the story. The player knows they'll need to record the 8th century melodies and that Gygas is the hidden evil. Since I'm assuming prior knowledge, I'll be glossing over the story from this point on and will instead be focusing on the main characters. If you haven't played the game, then this will go somewhat towards saving you from spoilers, but if you have, then you don't really need the entire game recapped. A constant in the opening tutorial was repetition and contrast. The player walks to and from the meteorite twice. The ambient night music is replaced when the story requires a different tone. These two constants guarantee that the player catches everything early on, which is important because characters like Ness's family and Pokey will continue to be essential to the game, but won't be getting a lot of screen time. After the tutorial section, Ness's party consists of himself, but that doesn't last too long because after battling a gang, obtaining his first melody, and taking out some cultists, he teams up with Paula, and I'll get a bit into her character after I discuss how the party system works. On the overworld, the other party members follow a delayed input from the player. If the player pushes up, then the party will all head up after the previous member has done so. It's essentially a conga line. The party can freely share items which effectively increases the inventory size with each member added. In combat, it looks like the standard Dragon Quest-esque turn-based RPG, but upon closer inspection, there's a bit more nuance to it which was designed to incorporate the game's running theme into the combat. The most obvious aside from character-specific moves is the HP meter. When a team member takes damage, the HP meter rolls down gradually, which gives the player a brief window to save that character if the damage dealt to them was too great. The very presence of such an option incentivizes the player to want to keep the party members around. Of course, the game's difficulty is balanced around the party, so there's never a moment where it's optimal to not have everyone in fighting condition, but the inclusion of this mechanic builds empathy towards the characters. To present growth, the game skips easy battles and adds depth with every character that joins the party. Finally, in addition to outright attacks, there are also side powers, items, and character-specific moves, which I'll explain in some detail as we delve into the 4 party members. Paula is introduced when Ness leaves Onett for Tucson and stays in a hotel. She telepathically contacts him, which means that the player's first interaction with her is through her defining trait. She's a powerful psychic, which is made evident should Ness talk to the residents of Tucson. Prior to actually meeting her, Ness can meet her parents, and if the player went to Paula's room, there'd be an interesting introduction to the teddy bear mechanic. Teddy bears are attack absorbers. Their purpose is to lower difficulty, but they also help enforce the fantasy of childhood since teddy bears are a toy. When Ness meets Paula, she's locked up, and to free her, Ness defeats a cult that's been manipulated by the Mani Mani statue. After this first meeting, but before defeating the cult, the player learns that Pokey has switched sides and is in fact aiding the cult leader. After freeing Paula, the first thing the player might notice is that she has a teddy bear. This means that the teddy bears are introduced to the player organically as a form of characterization no matter what. there's actually some discrepancy with Paula's character due to localization. From the events in the story and her fondness for teddy bears, it's easy to see that before localization, Paula was closer to the typical damsel in distress girl character, but engaging with her shows that she's got a feistier personality. This causes a bit of a disconnect with the game's story and Paula's character, but it's not game-breaking or anything close to that. I'd say altering her a bit actually makes sense, seeing as the game was designed to appeal to girls, a demographic the industry had stepped away from in those days, but I'd be lying if I said it comes without a price. But that's probably because I know about the localization change. It might not get picked up on organically. As Ness and Paula make their way to the town Threed, the player will become familiar with Paula's playstyle. In combat, she can be anything from a heavy hitter to controller, thanks to her varied psi abilities, and thanks to her character-specific move, the Prayer, which will serve to crush Gygas. She can even serve as the game's wildcard because the Prayer is a real gamble that refills the entire team's health just as easily as it can inflict on them crushing status ailments. Those status ailments are interesting in and of themselves, as they are either something character-driven like homesickness or something completely out of left field like being diamondized or followed by a ghost. Yep. After Ness and Paula reach Threed, it's not too long before they're ambushed in a hotel and get captured. In their captivity, Paula uses telepathy to contact Jeff. I'm a big fan of these moments in fictional universes. The moments where they use the conceits of their worlds for characterization. When Jeff is introduced, the game adds a new prominent character to its story, which might have been disastrous, but because of its excellent pacing and because Jeff was already sort of introduced in the naming screen and had been telegraphed back when Bus was still warning about Gygas, it's all very natural. Jeff lives in Foggyland, the Britain to Eagleland's US, and is staying in a boarding school. There are some neat tricks in the boarding school section the game uses to characterize him and to get the player to empathize with him. An example of the former is found by looking into his inventory and seeing the nerdy items he's got, and an example of the latter is having the player get frustrated on his behalf for being given a bum key. It's not too long before Jeff, with the help of his friend Tony, crosses the fence and leaves the boarding school. This leads him to a mini-adventure where he'll befriend a monkey, ride Tessie, the Loch Tess monster I guess, and finally, visit Stonehenge. Near Stonehenge, Jeff's arc is laid out when he meets his father, Dr. Andonuts. The two have a very strained relationship, and interactions between the two are awkward as. But there's no hostility, and Dr. Andonuts lets Jeff use his Skyrunner to fly over to Threed and rescue Ness and Paula. The flight to Threed gives quick glimpses of locations the player will visit later on, and while they do that with their ever-expanding party, they'll be introduced to Jeff through his playstyle. He's the scientist of the group, so he doesn't have any psi powers, but what he does have are items which only he can use in combat, and the knack for fixing broken items when the crew stays in a hotel. When he fixes the items, he'll usually create weapons that are more powerful than what he's currently carrying, and his ability to fix items is restricted by his IQ level. There's a real emphasis on Jeff's inventory and some interesting ways the game characterizes him with it. His introduction leads to the solving of Threed's zombie problem, the introduction to Saturn Valley, the Dusty Desert, and then Foresight. In Foresight, Paula gets kidnapped and Jeff and Ness get sent to Moonsight. This is a clever way to further introduce the player to Jeff on a mechanical grounding, since they not only have to learn how to best utilize him, but then have to redesign their playstyle to accommodate for not having Paula anymore. Eventually, they exit Moonsight and learn that it was an illusion created by the Mani Mani statue, which had found itself in the hands of a Mr. Monotoli. Also found in Mr. Monotoli's service is Pokey, who abandoned the cultists when they were defeated and immediately latched on to Mr. Monotoli as he was more powerful than the cult. But after Ness and Jeff broke the Mani Mani statue, its power over Mr. Monotoli faded and he returns Paula, which is when Pokey steals Monotoli's helicopter and abandons him as well. The crew then travels to Stonehenge and after some time find themselves in the town Summers, which is where, after eating a dubious cake, the game introduces Pooh. But first, since we've covered more than half the story, there's enough material to draw from to discuss EarthBound's world. I could go into theorizing meaning from the naming of the towns, but I actually don't want to stray too far away in discussing the world, so I'll be looking into two towns in particular. Those being Moonsight and Saturn Valley. The reason I want to discuss those two exclusively is because they're the game's hard spin into weirdness. All EarthBound needed to do to be a subversive RPG during its Western launch was to be set in modern times. But that's not all EarthBound did. EarthBound also showed how engaging characters can be as good a drive for gameplay as complex rules and engrossing worlds. EarthBound's rules are very straightforward, and the worlds seem to have been designed with the ethos of throwing everything in the kitchen sink. In addition to spitting in the face of conventional RPG worlds of the time, EarthBound also spat in the face of conventional Japanese video game worlds of the time, because whilst EarthBound's world isn't set in a traditional setting, it's also not nonsensical. If you search hard enough, you'll find that within the conceit of the game's world, everything makes sense. But an additional layer to that is that the game actually betrays the expectations it sets up. It does this by recontextualizing mechanics for ambience, and, as it did in the opening for characterization, the game uses contrast to perfect presentation. Every town has the basic accommodations of a shop, hospital, ATM, phone, and hotel. But by recontextualizing these accommodations to fit the culture that houses them, the game makes each area very legible, whilst at the same time giving each and every area a lot of personality. The towns range from classic Americana to mountain monastery without ever coming across as jarring. The Mr. Saturns in Saturn Valley get a lot of characterization from the recontextualization of the town staples. First and most obviously, the accommodations they provide are free. Also, their text boxes have a unique font, so the game effectively plays on the dialogue system as well. It also does this in Moonside by reversing yes and no, but that isn't so much for characterization as it is for strange ambience. One of my favorite places in the game is Saturn Valley's coffee spot. I was very tempted to include it in the script somehow, but it doesn't really add anything to the discussion. The world has more or less been summed up, though there's a moment in Moonside I want to show you, because it more or less sums up the entire game. Right, so after the crew ingests an hallucinogenic cake in a kid's game, the game essentially pulls the same trick it did when introducing Jeff. It leaves the party and introduces the final party member. Pooh is the crown prince of the Lam, who's liked by the girls and respected by his master. His introduction is simultaneously my favorite part of the game and my most despised part of the game. First the good. His introductory moment is amazing. Pooh undergoes mood training wherein the goal is seemingly to ignore all distractions thrown at him. The first is from a girl who tells him that his master wants to see him. If Pooh ignores her and keeps meditating, the game will use the combat system to betray his meditation. A spirit arrives and tears off Pooh's legs, causing him to lose a lot of health. The spirit then tears off his arms, which reduces Pooh's health to 0. The spirit then cuts off Pooh's ears, causing the sound This is very effective. It's probably the best bit of characterization in the entire game and essentially manages in a minute what for Ness, Paula, and Jeff took an entire segment. It builds up empathy and sets up the character. From this brief segment, the player knows that Pooh is of a more spiritual nature than the other 3 party members and that he has the mental fortitude to keep meditating throughout the Moo ordeal. Now, after guessing about this, you might be wondering how this could possibly merit being one of my most despised parts of the game. It's because he does very little afterwards. See, Pooh rejoins his master, gains a bunch of levels for completing the meditation, which is great since it sets up growth as something spiritual, then joins Ness's party and sort of falls by the wayside. There's an amazing character there that I feel isn't utilized as well as he could have been, and the fact that his introduction occurs in the final hours of the game certainly doesn't help. To combat his short screen time, the developers seem to have tried to capitalize on the mysterious side of his nature, but the result is sort of a mixed bag. After traveling across an ocean with the team, going to Scarab, and journeying through a pyramid, he leaves to study a new psi ability, but his absence isn't really as impactful as Paulus was in the Moonside section. Instead of providing a mechanical emptiness, for me, Pooh's absence only ever highlights how little he brought to the table. But I don't wanna be too critical here, since that's not the point of this video. The point is to understand EarthBound on its own merit, and under that scrutiny, Pooh is a good inclusion. His absence is in character, Pooh being a warrior monk, and although they aren't very prominent, there are a lot of interesting tricks the game uses to characterize him, like restricting how much HP he recovers from junk food, giving him the ability to mimic an enemy in combat, and giving him a unique armor set. Then, there's the fact that his inclusion shows how the core theme transcends further cultural barriers than Jeff's inclusion did. He absolutely earns his spot on the Geiger's bashing party, don't let a YouTube nitpicker tell you otherwise. Shortly after he leaves the crew, they meet the Dungeon Man and travel to the swamps of deep darkness, which is when he returns just after they find Mr. Monotoli's helicopter which Pokey had stolen. After traveling through the swamp, the crew enters Tenda village where they meet these shy little guys. To progress, they first need to travel underneath Stonehenge to free the only man who knows the location of the book which cures shyness. Then, after finding said book and giving it to these little guys, the crew gains access to Lumine Hall where, after seeing his thoughts on the wall, Ness records the 7th melody, and the crew then goes to the Lost Underworld where Ness records the 8th and final melody, which gives him access to Magicant, a realm composed of his mind. The hero's journey demands that before obtaining the power that leads them to victory, the hero must overcome manifest obstacles which culminate in the defeat of themselves, their inner demons. To defeat Gygas, Ness must defeat his own nightmare first, and this is where EarthBound introduces Magicant. Because when you need to present the hero's mindscape, why not just present the hero's mindscape? As I've been banging on about, it's composed of his mind, and this is truly the greatest bit of characterization Ness gets, so it's the perfect time to delve head-on into analyzing his character. So, in the opening, Ness was essentially presented as the most approachable video game protagonist of all time. Think about it. He's not a badass soldier like Solid Snake, or a flautist forest elf like my main man, Zelda. Ness is just a kid who likes Nintendo and baseball. I don't think there's a person out there who won't be able to link his introductory shot to their own childhood, which means that the player-character bond is there from the get-go. Also there from the get-go is Ness's family, which is the game's subtlest mechanical representation of its central theme. Every member of Ness's family provides some necessary aid, which means that Ness will need to stay in contact with them throughout the entire game. His father is Ness's source of finance as well as the game's progress saver. His little sister Tracy has a job with S Cargo Express, which means calling her is the only way to store items. And finally, calling Ness's mom cures his homesickness. By tying all of his family to the phone, even after going on his adventure, their presence isn't diminished. On the adventure, Ness is frequently shown to be selfless and helpful. The game takes its time setting up his ascension to monomyth hero. Every time Ness receives a sanctuary melody, he also receives strange visions wherein he watches himself as a baby and the like. This is the lead up to the power up he receives after leaving Magicant, but before he does, the player gets to use Magicant as an exploration of Ness's character. From interacting with Ness's perception of Pokey, the player realizes that not only does Ness not harbor bad feelings towards him, but he still considers him a friend. From interacting with previous bosses, the player realizes that Ness doesn't really seem to harbor ill will towards them either. This culminates in Ness fighting a boss battle against his own nightmare, symbolized as the Mani Mani statue. The Magicant area was designed to highlight Ness's good nature, so when his nightmare is defeated, it's easy to understand that his victory over his nightmare came from that good nature. Also, by presenting the nightmare as the Mani Mani statue, it's easy to see that either it had been trying to gain dominion over his will all along, or more likely, the Mani Mani statue which Ness encounters in the real world is in some way linked to the nightmare parts of all men, like some sort of driver for subconscious evil. In Pooh's segment, there were levels given for completing the Moo meditation which linked character growth to mechanical growth. Ness's exit from Magicant is also his victory of his mind, and it's represented with the Century's powers becoming his. As in, Ness obtains a heap of levels for overcoming his greatest obstacle. When Ness comes to, he is surrounded by his friends. This ends my analysis of the 4 main characters, but there are 3 more main players I want to talk about, and since they all have prominent roles in the game's ending, I'll be using it to frame my discussion of them. So, after Ness has awoken from Magicant, the crew heads to Saturn Valley, where they learn that to stop Gygas, they need to go to the pass where he is hiding. Before they do that, the game sends the crew back to Onat, which has been taken over by Gygas' minions. Every time Ness revisits Onat after the first segment of the game, the player's been made to reflect a bit on their journey. Onat is the point of Ness's origin, so it's fitting that Gygas' minions take it over, since it effectively paints Gygas as the perversion of innocence. When the meteorite has been reached and the crews returned to Saturn Valley, the game's darkest section truly starts. First, it sees the kids learn that time machines destroy the user's body. This leads to them abandoning their human bodies and taking robot ones instead. Thereafter, they time travel, and the path that leads to Gygas' cave is literally drowning in unsettling foggy lighting, and since the enemies are fairly unforgiving in this section, they create a feeling of disempowerment, which is amplified by the robotic bodies, the otherworldly visual design of the area, and it all culminates in this right here. This path of entrail-looking machinery leads to the realization of Gygas' being. Pokey, who had previously abandoned Mr. Monotoli, is now in league with Gygas, and from him we learn that there's some tragedy to Gygas' sorry state of being. Gygas' overuse of time travel has rendered him a mindless furnace of evil. The only thing that keeps him together is the machine, and after Pokey shuts it down, things get a bit hellish. Of the ending's 3 main players, the first one I wanted to discuss was Pokey. Pokey is literally Ness's opposite throughout the entire game. In the opening, Ness was a brave fighter whilst Pokey was a coward who played dead and innocent in combat. Ness's family is supportive and caring, whereas Pokey's family is mean and abusive. There's been a lot of setup for Pokey to become a tragic turnaround to the game's central theme throughout the game, and throughout the game, Pokey's been more and more influenced by Gygas, and he's continually broken alliances as soon as a more powerful partner presented itself. Ultimately, the only one Pokey had left to associate with was Gygas, and he's a mindless monster of pure evil. Instead of having others around himself, Pokey's actions continually lead him down the road to loneliness, and the tragic thing is, he was just one of Gygas' pawns. There's even an additional layer to the tragedy once you realize that Pokey's use of time travel will have detrimental effects on him as it did to Gygas. In his final appearance in the game, he's already turned a deathly pale, and his early game obnoxiousness has been replaced with sociopathic malice. Even so, it's not hard to sympathize with him. Pokey's search for more and more power is actually his quest for the power to make others like him. See, Pokey wants what Ness has, but goes about it the wrong way. The ultimate display of his tragic downfall is when he shuts down Gygas' devil machine. Once Pokey's unleashed Gygas, the ramifications of his actions are so dire that it's even spawned numerous unsupportable abortion allegories. Gygas covers the screen now, and his image is one which invokes pain. Pain of living, because Gygas is also alone. Gygas' own overuse of time travel has destroyed his mind, so his immense power is guided only by the evil which lay within him. And that power is manifested as incomprehensible attacks from what is essentially an incomprehensible cosmic god. That god had up until now been using his power to influence humans, animals, and even inanimate objects in his mad quest to stop Ness at all costs, and that quest literally cost him his sanity. In the end, Gygas pummels the party with immensely powerful attacks, which leads to the culmination of the game's core theme. Paula begins to pray, and as she begins to reach out to those that had helped and had been helped by the crew throughout the game, the player is made to reminisce about their journey up until that point and the bond they formed. Not only with the 4 main characters, but also the various characters whose lives the crew touched on their journey. Then, the culmination of the player-character empathy building reaches its own climax. And it happens right here, when Paula prays to the player to help the team. The 4th wall had been nudged and winked at throughout the game, and especially so in the final hours. This calling out to the player is very powerful because the player had been the only constant throughout the entire game. The player had been there for every major moment of the main character's development, except of course for Pokey. The incomprehensible creature that was with him throughout the entire game was Gaius. In many ways, Pokey is Gaius' avatar, just like Ness is the player's, but in accordance to the game's central theme, good wins out not by force, but through camaraderie. After the day is won, the group disbands and everyone goes their separate ways. There's a nice moment where Paula asks Ness to escort her back home, which recontextualizes the team walking together into a sweet little moment between the two. When Ness has returned to his home, he talks to his mom and his sister. Then, when the player is ready to wind the journey to an end, Ness takes a look at the photo album which Ivada's photographer has compiled. It's a nice reward and a somewhat sweet reflection on the journey. The credits themselves start by showcasing the game's characters, something it only gets away with because its characters were all as well developed and lovable as they were. After dues have been given out, there's a great moment where the player is treated to the most strangely comforting credit listing of all time. The game's story is not 100% linear, but the way I've described it more or less fits the majority of players' experience. EarthBound is an amazing game. It juxtaposes the innocence of childhood with the melancholy of adulthood and does it in the guise of celebrating childhood. This is a game where the kids are the heroes and the adults need saving. A game where there aren't game over screens, but rather encouraging try again screens. A game that's very serious about how it doesn't take itself too seriously. An RPG with a conscious effort to not include any general characters. The characters have personality in spades, and the simplistic presentation, though criticized in its time, has proven to be genius since the characters can distinguish themselves and stand out with a single phrase. It's one of the best games of all time, so if you went through this video without having played it, I want to assure you that neither this video nor any other on the game will ever be enough to get it. EarthBound is a magical emotion which makes you reflect on childhood and the goodness of man. It's universally appealing, and if there's anything I'd like to see the industry learn from it going forwards, it's that sincerity wins out over cynicism. A loving family may be corny, but they resonate. Lines like these strike a chord because they're unfiltered caring. It takes a lot more confidence to be sincere than cynical, and it always pays out in the end. I'm AesirAesthetics, and this was EarthBound. Alright, this was a really good one. For my next retro analysis, I'll be looking into a pre-2000s point-and-click adventure game. I have a good idea of which one I'll be covering, but if you want to throw in one of your favorites, be sure to comment below or tweet at me. When you've done that, you're free to like this video and subscribe for more content like this in the future. And hey, if you like this sort of content, I want to remind you to check out my previous retro analyses, which are linked in the bottom of the description box below. Also linked there is my Patreon page in case you want to kick in a buck to keep this party going. I want to thank the Nintendo, Retro Gaming, and EarthBound subreddits for their contributions to this video, and I'd like to express my gratitudes to Psycheomog and Jeremy for providing me with the footage you've been watching. Finally, I want to thank you for going on this journey with me, and I hope to have you aboard for the next one. Until then, best of times.